Today's dialogue will explore the complexities of addressing systematic sexual violence in mixed migration movements across the Americas, highlighting common challenges faced by practitioners in the region and increasing awareness of how the standards set out in the Murad Code can be applied to strengthen the collective response. These standards are organized under 10 key principles, which are on the current slide in Spanish, and which I'll also show in English in a moment. And the full Murad code can be found in English and Spanish at the website address in the corner of my screen. The issues we're discussing today could hardly be more urgent. According to UNHCR, as of mid-2023, there were 22.1 million displaced people in the Americas. Latin America and the Caribbean accounted for approximately 1/3 of all new individual asylum applications globally. Médecins Sans Frontières and IOM consistently report alarming levels of gender-based violence among migrant populations, with a significant proportion of women and children subjected to sexual violence and trafficking during their journeys. Human Rights Watch has reported on the physical, sexual, and verbal abuse that asylum seekers face at the hands of immigration officials at borders throughout the region. And survivors of all forms of sexual violence rarely approach service providers while in transit due to a lack of trust and fear of being re-victimized, retaliated against by the perpetrator, detained, or deported. This dialogue promises to share valuable insights from experts joining us from Panama, Chile, Guatemala, and the United States, who are involved in uncovering, documenting, investigating, and prosecuting sexual violence in the context of migration, regarding the standards they uphold in their work to ensure the safety, dignity, and rights of survivors, which is central to the Murad Code. Thank you to our panelists and to all of you for being here with us today. We appreciate your engagement on this important issue, and I'll now hand back to our moderator, Veronica Martinez.
Muchas gracias. En este seminario, primero nos acompaña la licenciada.
Thank you so much. We have with us Clarissa Martinez. She is the Deputy Ombudsperson of Panama. She holds a degree in political science and she has a certificate as a moderator and conciliator. She has a training in human rights with diplomas granted by OAS Mexico and Panama. Her previous work includes cooperation with the Ministry of Public Safety and the City Mayor's Office, among others. Thanks for joining us. From 2020 to date, over 1 million people on the move have been assisted by the Ombudsperson's Office after traveling across the Colombian-Panamanian border area of El Darién, according to the most recent statistics. In this period, several forms of sexual violence against migrants were documented. Recently, in June 2024, the Ombudsperson Office filed a complaint for over 400 alleged sexual crimes committed against migrants who were in transit across the border area. Which have been the main challenges in documenting sexual violence crimes, building survivors' trust in institutions, and ensuring they have access to justice? We give you the floor. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Veronica. It's an honor for the Ombudsperson's Office to be present at this very important Latin American dialogue on the Murad Code. I bring greetings from the Ombudsperson Eduardo Leblanc Gonzalez, who is on mission, and so he has given me this chance to provide, and she's frozen apparently. Thank you for the invitation to this office. As you mentioned, we at country level and within our Ombudsperson's Office have faced many challenges to monitor migrants, and we've seen this with the liaison office, which is the Darien Ombudsperson's Office. The joint work we do with ministries and international organizations helps us in all this. Firstly, there are challenges in documenting crimes. As to these challenges in documenting crimes, we can mention the lack of access, stigmatization and fear, limited capabilities of investigators, and insufficient evidence. As to the lack of access, we must mention very specifically that the Colombian Panamanian jungle is 100 kilometers long from Colombia to Panama, and it is currently, because of where it is located, it's a tropical jungle. So no matter the weather in Panama, which is very diverse, we don't know when it's winter or summer, but this area is a difficult zone for investigators to access and also court officers to persecute criminals. It's very difficult for all of us. As to stigmatization and fear, sexual violence survivors may fear retaliation, and that they've mentioned when we come up to them and interview them. They've mentioned it in the tools we use to obtain this information. They make a decision of just going forward. As to the limited capabilities of investigators, despite the efforts carried out by Panamanian authorities, we need joint cooperation. And that's what we've been doing in all these international and national fora that we have. Both the ombudsperson and myself and others have expressed that need that we have as an ombudsperson's office to obtain information from all countries of origin of migrants so that they cooperate with Panama. However, many do not cooperate. We work closely with the ombudsperson's office in Colombia and with the ombudsperson's office in Ecuador. From ombudsperson's office to ombudsperson office, we cooperate well, but at other levels, we are not provided information about people leaving the country and that are in transit. And as to insufficient evidence, I mentioned that the area is very hostile and jungle makes gathering physical and forensic evidence very difficult for the authorities, particularly when incidents are not immediately reported or when they're asked where something happened. We also have challenges to build survivors' trust. There's distrust among migrants towards institutions. There are also cultural and language barriers, the fear of the relatives that are not together with them but that lag behind, and also a lack of a humanitarian approach should be mentioned. And as to criminal cases, 90% or more have resorted to the ministry, public ministry, because of sexual freedom rights. Thank you very much for this first intervention, because it puts on the table the significance of all these data and how they link to the Murad Code. Each of these aspects are directly related to principles 5 and 6, talking about preparedness and of understanding the context of building support and competency systems, and to ensure safe and respectful relations and ensuring cooperation not only at the domestic level, but also the importance of coordinating among different countries, particularly in such complex contexts as is El Darién and the border between Colombia and Panama. From Guatemala, our next panelist is Carolina Suazo. She's a lawyer and magister in criminal law. She is an assistant prosecutor specialized in sexual and violent crimes, organized crime, money laundering, corruption. She works in the highly complex crimes area. where she investigates organized crimes, trafficking in persons, migrant smuggling, crimes related to commercial sexual exploitation of children, and adolescents and child pornography, among others. Welcome. In recent decades, Chile has become a key destination for intra-regional migration. Likewise, in recent years, the Chilean Public Ministry has implemented several initiatives to improve access to justice for survivors of sexual violence within the context of migration in collaboration with other countries. The office has achieved convictions and obtained valuable information through all these processes. Within this context, what lessons have you learned through your office's investigation and prosecution of crimes involving sexual violence against migrants?
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank you for the invitation and for the possibility of sharing with you issues that are so interesting and so important related to sexual violence in general during a migration process. So we've learned a lot, but we keep learning, taking into account that migration is a highly complex phenomenon and it's always changing. And so we are always facing different situations, new situations as time goes by. Therefore, we're not just talking about a static situation that we analyze or that we are addressing, but it is a situation that is always moving, changing, and we need to learn from the criminal prosecution and from the victim's protection perspective as well, to be able to adapt everything to the changing reality. And so in connection with this question, we need to have in mind three different pillars. First, sexual violence during migration processes, and let's highlight one aspect, which is extortion, which is a phenomenon that we have identified and that we also learned to be able to observe or identify it during criminal investigations. A second pillar has to do with sexual violence in the context of organized crime. And then a third pillar that we also think it's important to be able to answer this question that has to do with the protection of sexual violence victims during migration processes. So in connection with this first point, we need to discuss the situation of victims of human trafficking that are also victims of illicit migrant smuggling. And so I'm referring to victims, mainly women and girls and adolescents, the trafficking of whom is promoted by dealers that aim at having with the ultimate purpose of having them be abused. So if these victims provide resistance to sexual exploitation, they are transferred to a different destination within the same country, or they are sometimes transferred to a different country that is even further away from their country of origin. So this sexual violence situation that includes pornography, well, I'm going to make reference to it first, is very serious because the human rights of these victims are affected. But we need to bear in mind that in this scenario, other events can take place that are related to sexual violence during the transfer of these victims that are then made available for sexual exploitation. So this is sexual. We have to make a difference between the sexual violence suffered during the transfer, and this is something that is also suffered by victims of illicit smuggling of migrants, without necessarily this. There's no need for this to become, or for these victims to become victims of trafficking, right? But during the transfer process, we need to consider extortion as a way of corruption, where sexual actions or sexual attacks against the victims are very common. And I want to highlight this because frequently any event that could become sextortion is not referred to by the victims. This means that there is a form of sexual violence through the use of power that is not made visible in reality. And then secondly, sexual violence in the context of organized crime or complex crime is a permanent challenge from which we're learning significantly. And we had to adapt to the new reality by including protection measures that are much more, that are perhaps stronger and much more innovative, because they need to or to include relocalization of victims in a third country that is different from their country of origin and their country of destination. So there is terminology associated to situations related to victims of human trafficking in the context of organized crime. So if you're interested about this, interested in this, perhaps we can address this later. So another pillar is the victims of sexual violence during migration processes, and they need to make questions that have to do with their experience related to sexual violence. So the training of our judicial operators and everybody who is who have a who are in contact with migrants, it is important for them to make this phenomenon visible, talking about human trafficking and also sextortion, in addition to many other situations that are that become so evident.
Muchas gracias, fiscal, porque también retoma
Thank you,
aspectos relevantes
prosecutor,
respecto
for
de la protección y
making
garantía
reference
de
to
las víctimas
important
y sobre todo de su
aspects
acceso
regarding
a
the
la
protection of
justicia
victims
para
and their
lograr
access to
sentencias. En
justice
este
to be
caso,
able to
también
achieve
dentro de su
convictions.
conversación, usted
And
resalta
so in this
puntos que han
conversation, you
sido relevantes
highlighted
en el
items
Código
that were
Penal.
relevant
Por
in the
ejemplo, el
Mural Code.
principio
For
número
example,
4,
principle
respecto de
number 4
agregar
regarding
valor a
adding
las
value
investigaciones que
to
ustedes están
the
realizando mediante la
investigations that you are
minimización de
conducting
los
through
riesgos y la minimización
or
de
by
los daños.
minimizing the
O
risk
con
and
relación al
minimizing
principio 5,
the
que
harm.
tiene que
Or
ver con
also
una
principle
preparación
5 that has to
específica,
do with
sobre todo de
specific
coordinación
preparation
y cooperación para evaluar el
regarding
contexto en el
cooperation
cual se
and
desarrollan las
coordination by
intervenciones. Lo
assessing
mismo que el
the
principio 6,
context of the
conocer y
interventions, and
comprender
also
ese
principle 6,
contexto y
that
sobre
is
todo los
understanding the
daños,
context and also the
minimizando las
damage
repercusiones
by
negativas que
minimizing
pueda tener
the negative
la
consequences
investigación de estos delitos,
that the
considerando,
investigation of
al igual que lo
these
hizo la
crimes
mesa
could have,
anteriormente, que estos son
considering
delitos complejos y que en
that
este caso
these are
también están
complex
asociados con
crimes
delincuencia
and that they are
organizada.
related
Y por último, me
to
gustaría
organized
resaltar
crimes in
el
general.
principio número
And I would
7,
like to highlight
especialmente
principle
acá
number
en
7 that
amarillo,
you also touched
que es
upon,
construir sistemas,
which is to
competencias y
build
soporte, sobre todo
systems,
considerando
competencies,
que en
and
este
support,
sentido
by considering
esto
that in
tiene que
this
ver
regard,
mucho con la
this has to do
capacitación.
with
Muchas gracias.
training. Well,
Nos
it has to do with
acompaña de
training mainly.
Guatemala Eugenia
And
Judith
we
Erazo
have
Caravantes,
Eugenia Judith
quien actualmente coordina el
Erazo
programa
Caravantes
de
from
migración
Guatemala,
con derechos del
who
equipo
is the
Estudios
coordinator of
Comunitarios
the
y Acción
Migration with Rights
Psicosocial
program
ECAP, con
of the Team
experiencia
for
en el
Community Studies
acompañamiento a
for and
familiares de
Psychological and
migrantes
Social Action,
desaparecidos, acciones de apoyo a la reintegración de
ECAP,
niñas, niños y
with
adolescentes
experience
migrantes
in
separados
the
de sus
support
familias, atención psicosocial a migrantes
and
en tránsito, desplazados
accompaniment
internos
of
y a víctimas de graves
family
violaciones
members
de derechos
of
humanos. Es
disappeared
maestra en psicología
migrants.
social y violencia
She has
política.
a master's
Gracias
degree
por
in
estar
social
aquí.
psychology and
Las
political
personas
violence,
en
and we thank you
movilidad
for being
enfrentan
here.
múltiples formas de violencia sexual
Hmm.
que lo mismo
People
les
on the move
obliga a
face
mediar
different
que
ways
a
or
ver a la
multiple
violencia
forms of
sexual
sexual
como algo
violence, and
inevitable en
this
los
forces
múltiples
them to
tránsitos.
see that
Organizaciones
sexual
como
violence
ECAP
is something that is
desempeñan un
inevitable.
papel importante en la
Organizations
prestación de
such as
asistencia a
ECAP
les
play an important
sobrevivientes
role
a
in
lo largo
providing
de su
assistance to
trayecto, al
survivors
tiempo que
throughout
documentan
their
los impactos de la
journey,
violencia
while
sexual en las
documenting the
personas.
impacts of sexual
Según su
violence on
experiencia,
internally and
¿cuáles son los
internationally
principales retos que se
displaced
plantean a
persons.
la hora de
In your
aplicar
experience, what are
enfoques
the key
diferenciados
challenges
con el trauma
encountered in
y
relation
prestar
to
apoyo
applying
a las
trauma-informed
personas
approaches and
sobrevivientes a su
providing
desplazo?
psychosocial support to
Gracias.
survivors who are on
Buenos
the
días,
move?
muchas gracias
Thank
por
you.
la invitación a participar en este webinar.
Thank you for
Me
the
parece
invitation to participate in
relevante
this
conocer y
webinar.
difundir el
I
código
think it is very
penal
relevant
con
to
el que vamos a ver, pues
be aware
efectivamente
of
tenemos
and
muchas
disseminate
coincidencias en las prácticas
the Murad code, because we'll
concretas que
see that there are
realizamos.
many practices that we conduct
Yo
that are
hablo desde la
aligned with this
experiencia
code.
de campo.
I have
En el
experience
tránsito por
in the field during transit through Guatemala and also in the origin communities. So Guatemala is an origin, a country of origin, a country of transit, and also a country of origin. It's a very small path, but it's also transit through the USA. So prevalence of systematic sexual violence is one of the factors that promote migration in communities, together with poverty, the lack of opportunities, and also family reunification. According to investigations that we have conducted, women migrants, state that they migrate because they suffer sexual violence. Something that is important is that in Guatemala, 64,000 girls and adolescents between 10 to 19 years old became pregnant, and this is data from 2021. In most cases, these are the results of sexual violence. These are girls between 10 to 14 that are pregnant, and this is an alert it's just a warning actually for the country, and it discloses the systematicity of sexual violence in the origin communities. And we know that trafficking networks provide women contraceptives in the package of things in the travel kit, let's say, which includes, transfer and food and also contraceptives. So we are aware of cases of caregivers or parents that take their daughters to go to get the contraceptive injections before traveling. So sexual violence is assumed as a risk in migrating. And in a way, this is normalized. This is considered something normal that can happen. In returning, we find that women are stigmatized in the community because there is generalized information that it's likely that they suffered from sexual violence, and therefore they're not dignified enough. They're not worthy of having a husband and a family. When returning to their community, there are more conditions for psychosocial attention to address the violations to their rights. And in the reinsertion processes of girls, boys, and adolescents that were deported or that returned, we find risks upon return too. I'm sorry, but Judith's microphone is silenced. I apologize, Judith, but your microphone is off. Yes, I apologize. I was saying that in reinsertion processes, we also find risks for them, for these girls, boys, and adolescents to suffer from sexual violence. And we try to address our assistance to teachers and local leaders and ancestral communities and institutional networks to be able to create protection environments in the different communities that are focusing on girls, boys, and adolescents. And about migration in transit in Guatemala, we find that women and girls are at greater risk of sexual violence given their vulnerability conditions and the lack of community protections or governmental protection as well. The border of the Teculuman, which is crossing to Mexico, our team receives migrants from Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia, Honduras, and also from Guatemala, too, others. And the challenges that we find to provide assistance or care and support for them to make informed decisions is the little time they have because they want to go to Mexico quickly. This is something that is constant. And some of them stop for a few minutes, receive humanitarian aid, but they need specific where to charge their cell phones, where to take a shower, or where to receive a remittance, where they sleep. These are very specific things, water, food. And here, in some cases, we are able to document abuse patterns during their transit through our country. And we ask them, how do how was your transit through Guatemala? And they tell us that after the Darien, which is the worst thing that happened to them, and the worst thing is to go through Guatemala after the Darien because they're victims of abuse by the local police. And this is a situation that the police and the traffickers as well. And so the situation has gone down. We don't have specific statistics, but we think that this has gone down with the change in administration this year. The situation of abuses committed by the police. And our task of documenting this is for the purpose of making reports. We want to use this information to make reports. Additionally, we find these situations, and documenting sexual abuse cases is difficult for the victims because of the lack of credibility in institutions. Of course, we have a crisis with the prosecutor's office, as you probably know, being ashamed and also fear for other consequences is one of the main factors. Many of the migrant groups have a guide which actually make reference to the trafficking networks. And so this is one of the basic conditions for us to be able to conduct investigations and for us to be able to work with the victims. The difficulty for the support is the transit, because of what I was telling you. They usually don't want to stop. They want to go through very quickly. And there are some cases of men that were victims of sexual violence, but that is even more difficult to document. But we did have some cases during the armed conflict in Guatemala. We tried to, because we knew that there were cases, but for men, it is also, because of their psychology, it's much more difficult to accept what has happened and report sexual violence crimes. It's not the majority, but girls, boys, and women are the ones that are most affected. So I would like to stop now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judith, for sharing your experience. And I would also like to highlight the context revisited in the Murad Code and to talk about the different aspects. Your experience is related to Principle 3 that has to do with being responsible and ensure integrity, be reliable for victims. I mean, the limits that you have in providing assistance and the little time there is to provide such assistance. As in the other two cases, you mentioned Principle 6, which is the importance of the context itself to understand cultural approaches and gender-based approaches and the reasons why women are fleeing, as well as the impact or damages going from individual damages, collective damages, and institutional ones too, based on how the police forces act. And then there's Principle 7, which is how important it is to build systems, competency, and support based on the dignity of persons and the dignity as victims and as migrants in this case. And Principle 9, which is the preparation you have at ECAP to provide several different types of responses, not only to systematic sexual violence, but also to matters regarding migration. And that can have to do with humanitarian emergencies. With us here today also is Colleen Kivalan. She's an academic family medicine physician and an international expert and trainer with experience in forensic medical evaluations of torture, ill treatment, and human rights violations. She has broad international experience, including work in Syria and Ukraine, among others. She trains students, residents, and physicians in providing forensic medical evaluations to asylum seekers. She has assessed more than 500 survivors in the quest for evidence of sexual, physical violence, torture, and psychological impacts. Her special interests include assessments and support for survivors, girls, boys, adolescents, men, and LGBTIQ plus people. Thanks, Colleen. The number of forcibly displaced migrants entering the USA continues increasing rapidly each year, so much so that the United States currently serves as home to a fifth of the world's migrants. In your experience, what are the key barriers that prevent survivors from disclosing what has happened to them, both on their journey to the US and once they've arrived to seek asylum? Colleen, you have the floor.
Thank you, Veronica, and greetings to all the attendees, and special thanks to Clarissa, Carolina, and Judith for your insights. Veronica, you bring up the question of disclosure, and what I would say in my experience, we worry so much about re-traumatizing the survivors who pass in front of us. Disclosure is both a science and an art. Non-disclosure of sexual violence has multiple causes, as we've just heard, individual causes. Each one of these survivors has their own history that they bring to the border and that they bring to our centers. And they choose whether or not to share that information based on their own characteristics that they bring. In addition, there are all of the structural things like the organization and its relative safety, the social situation that they find themselves in each of our countries en route, the cultural beliefs that they bring with them and that they experience from the interviewer. Their literacy is a huge issue, and linguistic capability is an extraordinarily impactful issue between the interviewer who is seeking disclosure and the individual, the survivor, who has their own experience that they're bringing to that setting. So there are multiple barriers to disclosure, but this is what I know. Non-disclosure in sexual violence is extremely common, regardless of where it occurs and who the perpetrator is. Non-disclosure is the norm, and it takes weeks and months of trust, and sometimes years, to be able to disclose the significant sexual violence that occurred, especially in men, as several of you have mentioned, in children and adolescents, and people with diverse gender identities who are in transit. So learning how to support that disclosure in traumatic ways, however, is teachable. And I hope that we don't give up as a community with all of you as attendees in the fact that this is a science. Interviewing with an ability to get disclosure in short periods of time is a science and an art, and it's teachable. So I'll leave us with that for the moment and switch just for a second to some of our experience in my teaching hospital setting in San Francisco, in California, in the United States. So we're at the end of this journey. And that's my lens, my perspective on the survivor is hearing their entire story that includes their transit story. The majority of asylum seekers we see in Northern California are from Central and South America and Mexico. We certainly have 180 other countries where people are coming into that area, but the majority are from the countries and regions I just described. We collect data from each of those asylum seekers in a very unique protected electronic database called REDCap, REDCAP. It's in most teaching hospitals in the world, actually, that data system. We collect it in real time on our computers as we're talking, and the data goes into a protected database. So in seconds, we can identify who the Guatemalan women are, what ages they are, what education they are, and what sexual violence they describe. So it's a very powerful database for us, and it facilitates both research, evidence collection, and policy. The data includes demographics, and I'll just describe just a snapshot of our demographics for the last couple of years. And Judith, 33% of all of our asylum seekers are from Guatemala. 20% are from El Salvador, 18% from Honduras, and 19% from other countries, including Mexicans. We collect their age, we collect their gender, and very interestingly, I looked at Guatemala, actually, Judith, compared to the entire sample that we have. And there are many more women from Guatemala than any other country that we see. The disproportionate number of women leaving Guatemala is quite striking, actually, in our data, as well as what they're telling us. Those women from Guatemala who have made up that disproportionate number are disproportionately less educated than others, and the majority have 0 to 6 years of formal education. So literacy, culture, and linguistics become an incredibly important part of those interviews. The quantity and the diversity of violence is documented for every client and their impact. And I'll just do one line about their impact. And when I think about impact, I think of psychological, but also social and economic. 79% of all of our asylum seekers meet the criteria, international criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, 79%. And that's current. As you all know, the assessment for PTSD is the recent symptoms over the last 30 days. 79% of our people, regardless of how many years they've been illegal in the United States or how long it took for their transit. 63% of them meet the criteria for major depression, and 82% of our clients have both PTSD and depression diagnoses. And we know, and this is the most distressing feature, that about 65% of our men have experienced sexual violence, and almost 80% of our women have experienced sexual violence, either in their own country or in a transit country. So the prevalence is extraordinarily high, including in men and including in children, and very especially in trans women. So unfortunately, asylum and refugee forensic documentation in the United States does not collect information on transit violations. It's violations that occurred in their country of origin. And so we send this message about not caring about what happens during transit. We know it's significant. We know it impacts their mental health and their ability to acculturate in this extraordinarily new environment for them. And yet we don't collect the data. So that's going to be one of my recommendations today to all of us, and that it's important to not only know the violence that occurred and the reasons for migration from their home country, but also what occurred in transit countries. And frankly, at the US border and in their early months being in the United States, many of them are in detention facilities during that time. So while some information about the transit can be captured for our clients in narrative statements, events such as sexual violence occurring by country as they move through their transit are not data that are routinely collected. And I believe that only when we understand the prevalence and the impact and the barriers of reporting sexual violence in transit can we begin to address exactly how this should be a standard data element for all of us internationally. It should be collected, and we should use it to create change in policy. So again, sexual violence in transit, in our experience, in these 370 now cases that we've done over the last couple of years, sexual violence is the norm in our population. regardless of their home country, including Africa and Southeast Asia and other countries we see regularly. That sexual violence happens during childhood, it happens during adolescence, it happens during adulthood in their own country, and it happens during transit. And if we choose to not ask about transit or migratory violence and its impact on current symptoms and mental health, we lose a tremendous opportunity with these clients and survivors to be clear that their transit journey is relevant to their current mental health and their current decision about whether and how they stay in a third country. So in closing, given its high frequency and its serious impact, how do we make asking these questions a routine, normative part of all refugee and asylum seeker interviews, regardless of all of the barriers? How do we learn to do that together? And in order to document those violations, we need consensus on what those key questions are. What are not only the principles of how we ask, but what are those questions that we ask and how do we document that? I have a couple recommendations we can talk about later of at least 3 data elements that should be collected for all of our survivors to be able to understand the extent of the issue. And finally, I'll just say, as I told my fellow panelists this morning, I did a forensic interview last night on an amazing and courageous woman from Nicaragua who described her decades of sexual trafficking and her being locked in homes for periods of months, and her outrageous amount of sexual violence that she tolerated starting at age 14. And she told me that her journey to the United States didn't matter because it paled in comparison to her childhood and adolescent experiences. And yet, when I asked her more about her transit, she told me that she's no longer sleeping at night because she trained herself during transit to not sleep at night. Given all of the men who accompanied her and the male coyote who accompanied her to the border at the United States. And so these discussions that we're having today about the importance of what happens in transit will absolutely impact decades of mental health for our survivors. Thank you, Veronica.
Muchas gracias, Colleen. Y debo decir que para
Thank you,
mí, ser
Colleen. I must
moderadora y
say
resumir lo que
that
estás
being a moderator
considerando en
and
los
summarizing
principios
what you
es
point
una labor
out
muy compleja.
is a very
Todo lo que
complex
ustedes
task.
han
Everything
comentado
that
es
you have
altamente valioso
mentioned
y en
is
este
very,
caso,
very
por
valuable.
ejemplo,
And in this case,
hablar
for
de la
example,
divulgación o
talking about
revelación de la violencia
disclosure
sexual y
of
las
sexual
implicaciones que ello
violence and
tiene,
the implications that that
está
has
considerado también dentro de los principios, aunque puede
is
decirse
considered
fácil, pero
within
la
the
verdad es muy
principles. And it's
complicado.
easy to say, but it's
En
very
este
hard
caso, me
to do.
gustaría resaltar
And in this
4 de los
case, I'd like to
principios que
highlight
en el
4 of the
código
principles
ya lo
included
mencionan, pero
in
sabemos que en
the
la
code.
práctica es todo un
We
reto.
know that this
El
is a
primero de
challenge in
ellos
practice.
es
The first
entender
one
a
of them
las y
is
los y les
understanding
sobrevivientes como
the
individuos, como
survivors
seres
as
humanos, adaptarse a
individuals,
su
as human
individualidad
beings,
del
adapt
sobreviviente,
to
a sus
their
propios ritmos, a
individuality,
respetar su
to their
identidad,
pace,
a
to
la
respect their
inclusión y a la no
identities, to
discriminación. Y esto
inclusion
incluye la
and
no discriminación
non-discrimination.
en
And
temas,
this
por
includes
ejemplo, de
non-discrimination
alfabetización,
regarding
nacionalidad, género,
literacy,
como aquí se ha resaltado.
nationality,
El
and
segundo de
gender.
ellos es
The
respetar el
second
control y
principle
la
is to
autonomía
respect
de
control and the
los
autonomy
sobrevivientes.
of
Y esto
survivors.
también implica respetar
And
las
this also
decisiones, por
entails
ejemplo, su decisión
respecting
de
their
revelar o
decisions,
no
or
violencia
for example,
sexual,
their
que
decision
exista
to
control
disclose or
de
not
las y los
disclose a
sobrevivientes
situation of
sobre
sexual
su
violence.
información, sobre la
They
toma
have
de
to have
decisiones
control
con
over
apoyo
their
de los
information
profesionales
about their
clínica,
decision making, with
respetando
the
sus
support, of
propios
course, of the
tiempos,
clinic.
reduciendo
And
las presiones,
we also need to
pensando que
respect
detrás
their
de ellos
times,
también
their
hay impactos
pace, because
específicos
we need
como el
to think
trastorno de
that
estrés
there's
postraumático.
there
También
are
el principio
impacts on
número
them. For
4 que
example,
tiene el 3
the
que es dignidad y
PTSD.
respeto, y
And
el
then principle
4 que es
number 3,
validar
that
el
is
grado.
dignity
Y
and
respecto
respect,
del número
number 4 is value added. And regarding this principle, what are the alternative sources to be able to build profiles, to take into account minimizing the risk when information is being gathered, and also the importance of establishing prevalence as standard data for future investigations that or research that entails not re-victimizing the survivors. And so these are all important questions, but time is of the essence. We'll go on to our next panelist. Clarissa, you were telling us about the difficulties in investigating crime, particularly the effort that the Ombudsperson's office is making regarding the reports filed, more than 400 alleged crimes and more than 400 alleged victims. Would you explain to us what will happen with these reports or these complaints regarding the sexual violence that were presented? What resources, what recourse to justice do these complaints offer to survivors? Thank you. Thank you, Veronica. Once again, I would like to thank all the international organizations, the ministries, everybody who made contributions, and the panelists for sharing their experiences. As I mentioned before, regarding criminal cases, more than 90% of the complaints to the public ministry regarding sexual freedom don't get to a conclusion, and there are several factors involved in this. And mainly, it's that because perpetrators cannot be identified, they're no longer in the area, or when people are asked questions in detail regarding the time, the mode, the situation, these persons need to continue their transit. They don't have time to answer questions. Regarding the actions by the Ombudsperson's office, as you mentioned, Veronica, before this office, through its head, presented in June 2024 this criminal complaint, and currently this complaint is under the charge of the first prosecutor's office specializing in organized crime. And there are several investigations going on. Also, the Ombudsperson's office can make recommendations about strategies. For example, number 1, to strengthen institutional presence of the security forces by the Ministry of Security of Panama and also by the other authorities that need to be present in the area. For example, migration authorities, ministries, to be able to ensure the availability of trained personnel, trained in in human rights and also in sexual violence, in addition to establishing cross-border mechanisms. This facilitation that we have to be able to have a dialogue with authorities in Colombia and between Colombia and Panama's authorities to be able to investigate and prosecute crimes, because these are persons that come from different countries and that went through these two countries. And in this connection, as I said before, we have a good communication right now. And so as the Ombudsperson office, an early warning was issued so that this follow-up process to continues to be able to strengthen the mechanisms that we mentioned. We need to protect and continue communicating with the authorities of both countries. Regarding other strategies, I can mention the creation of safe spaces where the authorities in Panama must provide safe places so that survivors have access and can be relaxed to be able to file a complaint as soon as possible, because what they experience is usually terrible. And if they left their countries of origin, it's because they had a need to leave and because there were different situations, not because they had plans to leave their countries. And so we need to provide ease of access. We need to provide empathy. Need to treat them in a natural environment because these are very difficult situations. In addition to awareness raising campaigns, which would include, for example, working with the migrant communities to provide information about their rights and about the resources available, promoting their trust in the authorities in each one of the countries in transit, and also gathering data and monitoring, which would help us strengthen systems to document information of systematic sexual violence in contexts of, human mobility, to be able to have and inform protection programs. This is similar to what Colleen was making reference to, the importance of gathering information, because there was a significant increase of these situations. And once again, we don't need to re-victimize persons, but we need to make the effort to be able to be present there to provide assistance at the right time. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.
Muchas gracias nuevamente, licenciada.
Thank you
Y
once
en este
again.
caso me gustaría mucho resaltar
And I
el
would like to
contexto
highlight,
de su
in this case,
participación en
the
el
context
principio
of your
número
intervention
7 del
in
Código
connection
Rural,
with
que es
principle number
construir
7 of
sistemas,
the Bureau's Code, that is
competencias
to
y
build
redes
systems,
de
competency,
apoyo. ¿Y por qué es
support networks.
importante resaltar
Why is
este
this
punto?
important?
Porque todo lo que usted nos
Because
comenta
everything that
son
you
retos
told
que
us
enfrentan las instituciones, nuestras
includes
instituciones en América
challenges, the
Latina.
challenges that we
Dentro de
face
ellos,
as
fortalecer la
institutions in
presencia
Latin America.
institucional,
For
la
example,
coordinación y
strengthening
apoyo
institutions,
institucional, sobre
getting
todo que estos apoyos
coordination
sean
among institutions.
adecuados,
And we have to have
garantizar ese soporte
support that is
adecuado en un
adequate. We
marco
need
de
to ensure
seguridad,
that
continuidad y
adequate
consistencia, considerando que
support
los
in
riesgos
a
no son
framework of
menores. En su
consistency, because
participación
the
anterior nos
risks
hablaba de la
are not
delincuencia
minor.
organizada y
Before you
las
were making reference
dificultades
to
que se
organized
viven en
crime and the
zonas
difficulties
geográficas tan complicadas
that occur
como
in
la
very
región del Darién,
complicated geographic,
siendo no solo una
geographic
selva,
areas,
sino
such
también
as
una
the
zona
Darien Gap,
fronteriza que implica la
because this is
coordinación a
a
veces de
border
2
and
o
this
3
entails
o más
coordination
países.
among 2
Muchísimas
or 3
gracias.
countries.
En
So
esta
thank you.
segunda ronda,
Thank you. And in this
en
second
la
round,
participación anterior, la fiscal Carolina nos había hablado
Prosecutor
acerca
Carolina
de los
made
retos
reference
que tienen
to
y
the
también de
challenges
las oportunidades
that
que han venido desarrollando para
they have and
garantizar
also the
el acceso a
opportunities
la
that they had
justicia.
to
Y
ensure access to
principalmente desde un
justice,
punto de vista, como
mainly
también lo
from
estableció la
a
licenciada Carolina,
perspective
de violencia sexual
of
sistemática. ¿Cuál es la
systematic sexual
importancia de las
violence. So,
investigaciones y
what
los
is the
procesos
importance of
judiciales y las
investigations
sentencias
and
contra los
judicial
perpetradores para
proceedings
las víctimas
and
y sobrevivientes de
judgments
violencia sexual
against
que
perpetrators for victims
inicialmente
and
expresan
survivors
un
of
deseo
sexual
de
violence
olvidar
who
lo sucedido?
initially
Gracias.
express a desire to forget
Gracias
what
por la
happened?
pregunta. En primer
Thank
lugar,
you. Thank you for your
hay un
question.
importante
First,
desafío de
there is an
detección
important challenge
de
to
violencia sexual. O sea,
identify
antes que
sexual
eso,
violence. But
si
before that,
trabajamos, por
even, if we
ejemplo,
work, for
con
example, with
víctimas de tráfico ilícito de
victims
migrantes
of
o
illicit
tenemos
migrant
acceso a
smuggling,
migrantes
or
que han
if we have
sufrido
access
violencia
to
sexual,
migrants who have
sin
suffered
duda, para
from
un
sexual
magistrado
violence,
Colín es muy
as Colleen
difícil
expressed,
acceder a la
it is
información
very
que
difficult to
tienen.
have access to the
Porque
information
esa
that they
violencia
have,
sexual que han
because
sufrido
sexual
durante
violence that they
el
suffered
paso por
from
distintos países
during
se
their
suma
transit
a
through different
otras
countries
situaciones de violencia sexual que han sufrido a lo largo de
is
su vida.
something that is added to
Entonces,
other
el primer
situations of sexual
desafío es de
violence that they suffer
detección
throughout
de las
life. And so the
situaciones.
first challenge is to
Pero
identify those
desde la
situations.
investigación, desde el proceso
But
penal e incluso el juicio oral, el
we
gran
have a
desafío
criminal
es,
process,
una
and
vez
the
que
main
se logra
challenge, or
obtener esa
one big challenge, is
información
that
por
after we
parte
obtain that
de las
information
víctimas, que son las
from the
personas
victims
afectadas,
or from
es no
those
hacer
who
recaer
suffered from this,
únicamente en ese
is to
relato todo el
not
peso de la
only
prueba.
rely
¿Esto qué quiere
on
decir?
that
Que hay
narration
otros
to provide evidence.
mecanismos
This means that there are
probatorios, hay
other
técnicas especiales de
evidence
investigación
mechanisms.
que
There are
deben
specific and special
necesariamente
investigation
ser
techniques
utilizadas en
that
este
need
tipo de
and
casos,
must be
de tal
used in this
manera
kind of
de
cases
evitar en
to
la medida de lo
avoid,
posible
to the
la
extent possible,
exposición de la
the
víctima
exposure
en un
of the
juicio oral,
victim
por ejemplo,
in a, for
que
example, in an
suele
oral,
ser
legal or criminal
prácticamente todos los
proceeding,
sistemas judiciales de la región, un
because
requisito
this is
prácticamente
a
esencial,
requirement that is
pero
essential
que
in most legal
creo que
systems
desde el
in the
trabajo
region. But
que estamos
based on the work that
realizando
we
desde hace
have
varios
been
años
conducting
al
for many,
interior,
many
por
years,
ejemplo, de la
for
red
example,
grande, la red
in
de fiscales
the
especializados en trata de
prosecutors
personas y tráfico ilícito
network
de
that
migrantes, es
specialize in
precisamente
illicit migrant smuggling
intentar y hacer
and
y poner
human
todo el
trafficking,
esfuerzo,
we need
digamos,
to make
en
efforts
evitar que
to,
la
or to
víctima
focus our efforts
declare en el
in
juicio y evitar, sin
preventing or
duda,
avoiding
hacer
the victim,
recaer en
or
esa
avoiding
defensa
having
todo
the
el peso
victim
de
testify
acreditar hechos de
during the criminal proceedings.
Y en este sentido,
And so in this
obviamente,
regard,
existe es relevante llevar
it
estos
is
casos a juicio.
important to
Bueno,
take
la
these
finalidad
cases to the
finalmente
judiciary.
las
The
investigaciones y
ultimate
procesos
purpose of
judiciales
these
son
investigations and criminal
extensas y
proceedings,
desde distintos puntos de vista, pero
well,
enfocándonos
the main
en la
purpose is
pregunta,
a huge one, but
no
focusing
solamente
on the
tiene
question,
por objetivo el castigo a los
the
responsables de los
purpose is not
ilícitos,
only to
su
punish
prevención, la
the
anticipación, digamos, de
perpetrators.
víctimas potenciales que pudieran estar
We
en
also want
procesos
to avoid having
evaluados
potential victims
durante o mientras
during,
se
for
rescata una
example,
víctima, sino que
another
también
victim
tiene
is
que
rescued.
ver
But we
con
also want
la
to
reparación a las
provide
víctimas y el cierre
reparation
de un
to the
ciclo
victims
que
and for them to be able
obviamente
to
de
close a
acuerdo a lo
cycle
que ella han
or a
vivido.
stage
Y cerrar el
of their
ciclo,
experience.
si lo
And this
denominamos
closure,
de esa
we
forma,
call this
se
closure
vincula también o
because
puede
it connects or it
relacionarse
is
también
related
con obtener
with
al menos una reparación
obtaining at
económica.
least economic
Siempre
redress,
es bueno
economic
recordar que nos
reparations. It's
encontramos
always good to
en
remember that
presencia de personas
we
altamente vulnerables que
that these
sin
people are
duda
highly
dentro
vulnerable
de las
and
distintas
that
vulnerabilidades
within the
que
different
han presentado,
vulnerabilities they
ya
have
sea
and they have
familiar
had
o por
to be able
cualquier
to
otro
migrate
motivo, es
or
precisamente la
to need to
vulnerabilidad
migrate,
económica.
we
Y
can
esta
see these
confianza que debe
economic
generarse
vulnerability
con
and the
las
trust
personas que han sufrido
that needs to
violencia
be built
sexual, sea en contexto de trata de
with
personas,
these
sea en contexto
people that have
de
suffered from
traslado por
sexual
madres
violence. And I'm
mujeres
talking about
explotadas
different
habitualmente en el
situations,
país
those that were
destino,
transferred to be
tanto
sexually exploited in the
con
country of
respecto a las
destination,
personas que han
or
sido
those who migrated,
afectadas por una situación de
and those
tráfico
who were
masivo de
also
migrantes, tiene
affected by
que
illicit
visualizar o
migrant
considerar
smuggling. We
una
need to take into
intervención muy
account
masiva que
that there has
respete
to
los
have,
tiempos
or there has,
de
we have to
las
have
víctimas.
an
Y
intervention
en
that
este
respects
sentido es importante
the
también
times of
considerar que las
victims.
distintas legislaciones
And
han
we
ido
need to consider that the
avanzando
different legislations
en términos de otorgar, por
included
ejemplo, permisos
provisions that provide,
temporarios de
for example,
residencia,
temporary
visas
residencies
humanitarias
or
a
humanitarian
víctimas de
visas
trata de
to
personas o
victims
de
of
tráfico de
human
migrantes. Porque cuando
trafficking
se genera
or
ese primer
migrant
contacto,
smuggling.
esa
Because
primera
when this
entrevista
first
con la víctima,
encounter,
lo
this
primero
first
que es
interview is conducted
necesario
with a
señalar es
victim,
que no van
the
a
first
sufrir
thing that we need
ninguna
to point
consecuencia
out is
negativa
that there's going
por
to be no
indicar
negative
o contar la
consequence for
evidencia
them
que
just by
han
expressing
experimentado
what they have
y que hay
experienced,
posibilidad
and that there
de que
are
tienen
possibilities that
acceso
they
a
have access
permisos en
to
el país de destino. Ahora,
leaves or to
respecto a las
permits to
víctimas
reside in the
del
country,
tráfico ilícito de
in the country of
migrantes,
destination. Regarding
ha sido un poco más lento,
victims
digamos, la
of migrant
consideración
smuggling,
o el
the
trámite de esos
consideration or the
permisos.
proceeding to be
Cuando
able
las
to get
autoridades
those
tienen
permits is a bit
conciencia de este
perhaps more
fenómeno,
slow.
cambia
So when
completamente
the
la
authorities are aware
perspectiva
of
de
this,
ese primer
their perspective
acercamiento y la
changes. Their
perspectiva de la
the first
entrevista.
approach or the
Y
first
es
interview changes
impresionante la
completely.
información que se
And it
puede
is important
obtener
to see
precisamente
that a
respecto
significant
de ellas,
amount of information can be
porque claro,
obtained if there
como
is trust
se indica en la
from the victims, I
pregunta, las
mean,
víctimas dicen, bueno, ya llegué,
because
pasó el
victims say, okay,
tiempo,
I'm
pero ¿qué
here.
pasó?
The
Ya
past is in the
no
past.
lo
It's
dejan
over.
atrás como un
So what happened,
mecanismo
they
también de
want to leave what happened in the
protección
past
y
as a
de
protection mechanism
sobrevivencia
as well, and a
de
survive in order to
de alguna
survive too,
forma. Se
in a
generan,
way.
y desde el punto de vista de la
And so
investigación,
from
importantes
the investigation
coordinaciones y
perspective,
colaboraciones a
we
nivel
need to have
internacional,
cooperation,
pero
international
que
cooperation,
se
and this is important.
dificultan
But
sobre
this
todo
is
en países
difficult,
de tránsito, en
particularly
que
in
también las
countries
víctimas
of transit,
requieren pasar en forma
because
bastante
victims need
rápida.
to
Entonces,
or want to go through these
para
countries
terminar, en este
fairly
contexto,
quickly.
¿cierto?
So
Es
to wrap
que
up,
es
in a
importante o
context
es
where it is
fundamental
important or it is fundamental
respetar
actually to
la,
respect
la no victimización, ¿cierto? El principio de no
the
victimización de las personas que
principle
han sido
of
afectadas.
not
Señalar en primer
victimization of
lugar
the
que la
people who have
víctima
been
no
affected,
puede
we
ni
need to
debe ser
point
el
out
único
that the
sustento
victim
probatorio.
should not be
Y
the
en
only
segundo lugar,
evidence.
que existen
And secondly,
mecanismos
there are mechanisms
de declaración anticipada o declaraciones por
to
videoconferencia que puedan
have,
ser
for example, the
utilizados.
statements
Eso
made by
además de
video
los
conference or
mecanismos
early,
de
perhaps,
protección,
in
como
addition to protection
les
measures,
indiqué, en
such
que
as the one I
fue
mentioned
necesario
before,
o ha sido necesario incluso
because it
innovar
was necessary
por
to
sobre la legislación
innovate and
interna,
go
por
faster
ejemplo,
than our
utilizando
internal laws
las
by using, for example,
disposiciones de la Convención de
the
Naciones Unidas
provisions
sobre la
of the UN
Delincuencia
Convention
Organizada
on
Transnacional,
transnational organized crime, and this allowed us to relocalize victims in third countries because this is something that is fundamental. Thank you.
Al contrario, fiscal, muchísimas gracias
Thank
por su
you,
participación.
Madam Prosecutor. Thank you very much for your participation. I'd like to focus on two principles now because your intervention as well as others have been very enriching as to the work carried out under the Murad Code. I'd like to mention Principle 3, to be responsible and ensure integrity, not to or to be better accepted by the victims. And then there's a principle of responsibility, but principles 5 and 8 highlight what you have mentioned. Principle 5 says that preparation is the basis, is the foundation, and we have to know who else is collecting information, and being able to coordinate is essential, not only for the victims themselves, but also so that the cases taken to court are successful. Now, as to number 8, and the importance of REDCap, it has to do with collecting information from other sources that not only rely on the statements made by victims. We've got to seek information from other sources, and cooperation that we generate through networks like is the network and others too, as you've pointed out, for the protection of victims, respecting their dignity and the principle of no harm. As already pointed out in the previous intervention, Judith had talked about the importance of gender. And in this regard, well, I'll go back. She talked about gender and saying you work not only with girls, boys, adolescents, and women in transit, or those who have undergone refoulement and other returnees. How does gender and other intersectionalities have an impact on the needs of survivors, and how are teams prepared to address differentiated impacts? Thank you.
Sí, gracias, Verónica. Mira, yo veo
Thank you, Veronica.
escuchando a las otras panelistas como dos
Listening to the other
ámbitos
panelists, I
trabajo,
can
porque la
identify
investigación
two
para
areas:
procesos de justicia, digamos,
investigation for the
de delitos
courts
sexuales, digamos, tiene
regarding
marco
sexual crimes have a given
definido,
framework, a
y
defined
muchas veces
framework. And many
en las
times
prácticas lo que vemos es
in
como
practice, what
falta de
we see
preparación,
is a
la
lack of
experiencia por acá.
preparedness. I
Ver
don't
los
know what your
entrevistados,
experience is, but the
esta idea
interviewers are
de
not
obtener
duly
la prueba
prepared. The idea
inmediatamente,
of
¿verdad? Y
obtaining
sobre una
evidence
entrevista, sobre todo porque son
immediately.
entrevistas muy estructuradas, ¿verdad?
These are very structured interviews that must go into a database to document the crime.
Nuestra experiencia es que la capacitación
Our
a los
experience shows
entrevistadores,
us that
sean
training
fiscales, abogados,
interviewers, whether they be
tienen
prosecutors,
una formación
lawyers,
verdaderamente
attorneys, I
está
mean,
enfocado efectivamente muchas veces a obtener
many
las
are
pruebas.
trained
Y
and they
la falta de
to
capacitación
focus
ahí,
on
digamos,
obtaining
sí
evidence,
puede
and
originar
the
lo que
lack of
estamos buscando, lo que
training can
queremos
bring
evitar, ¿verdad?
about
La
what we
revictimización,
want to avoid, the
el trauma secundario,
re-victimization,
etcétera, ¿no?
secondary
Entonces,
trauma, and so
ahí,
on.
digamos, la estrategia,
So the
porque ya en muchos
strategy
países efectivamente se
that I
aplica,
think is
esta como una
being
estrategia
applied in many
psicológica,
countries is a
donde
psychological and
especialistas
legal
de la psicología
strategy
social,
where
clínicos,
psychosocial
participan en
experts,
este proceso y
clinicians,
sean
they
los
support
principales
the
entrevistadores,
prosecutors,
pues tienen que
and
trabajar
they'll be the
juntos en las
main
entrevistas
interviewers.
de
So
manera que
they've got to work together in these
esa misma
interviews.
entrevista no
So
afecte, sino que
the
permita
interview
al
does not
entrevistador tener las
affect
pruebas,
the
pero también
person,
sea
but
reveladora
allows obtaining
mutuamente, ¿verdad?
evidence, and
Transformadora para
that
las víctimas.
to a
Esto
certain
es algo que
extent
hay que
be able
capacitar
to
muchísimo
redress victims to. We've got to train staff, and our institutions sometimes face that obstacle. But I believe it's an important practice. I don't know if I'm diverging from the question, but investigation for legal proceedings is one thing. And then another important matter is language. We're in a country where 22 Maya dialects are spoken. So to gain access to justice, we must understand the language and also have an idea of the cultural interpretation by the victim of what that person has experienced. And it must be the victim's voice that is heard, but ensuring cultural interpretation. In Guatemala, the victims of the armed conflict, well, there's no word in the Maya dialect or language to express sexual violence or rape. And the lawyers wanted them to express that. But they said they went through me. I mean, and so we need to train our teams, no doubt, so that interpretations are appropriate to each culture according to who the victim is. It's a gender matter, but also it's a cultural issue. And we need to have experts who speak these languages or dialects. In the US, I suppose it should be the same because you receive people from different places. In the South, or those coming from the South, aren't this case or don't represent this case. But then we've got to take good care of the teams. They've got to be professionally trained, prepared, and many times the institutions don't take proper care of the teams, whether they're prosecutors, physicians, lawyers, but they don't support them appropriately. And they, on an ongoing basis, hear strong statements on human suffering. So then we have the secondary trauma that brings about exhaustion, wear and tear, burnout. And there is an institutional responsibility in caring for professionals, for practitioners. And then sensitiveness is lost, interest is lost, and there's one interview after another. And the victims perceive when there's no longer interest in them when they're being interviewed. And then there are other conditions for investigating and disseminating. They're more of a more academic nature. And it's a sort of investigation action with psychosocial support, and there's more group work with the victims using different mechanisms and the theater of the oppressed and others. I mean, it's different to document when you want to disseminate this phenomenon. So I'll wrap up with that. I know there's a lot more to say, but well, let's see if when we get the questions, we can further explain this. Thank you very much, Judith, for revisiting very relevant points. You were talking about the importance of disclosure by men, even within the armed conflict. This was difficult, as you said in your first intervention. And among population on the move, it's also difficult for men to disclose this. And there are other relevant points you've touched on included in the Murad Code, the difficulties on the ground and how these principles materialize. There, Principle 6 getting to know the context and then gender too. But now you've talked about understanding the context and the language more specifically. And in the case of indigenous communities, the importance of these languages that are not duly recognized and not considered by institutions. Then secondly, culture, not only the lack of words in a given language, and also how re-victimization can damage them. And then as to Principle 7, building systems, competency and support networks, I'd like to highlight 7.3, 7.4 and 7.10 here. The first has to do with developing appropriate competencies through training teams in civil society and at institutions. Secondly, select appropriate teams and partners. When we train, we've got to know who we train to. And finally, managing risk of vicarious trauma that we hadn't talked about, but is very important given the different interventions today. Thank you very much. Our last participant, but last but not least, of course, had talked about all the complexities of sexual violence from the country of origin to the country of destination. And you also touched on many significant aspects of disclosure, data, interventions, and institutional strengths to provide an appropriate response. Colleen, what aspects of the process of seeking asylum are the most harmful and re-traumatizing for survivors in the US? And how could these aspects of the process be improved? You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. I'll be brief so that we can get to the attendee questions. First, I would just reiterate the message to our refugees and asylum seekers when they arrive, at least in our country, and I believe throughout Europe and other sites, is clear. What happens during transit or deportation is not our problem. It is the cost of your journey. It is what happens when you leave your country and you move through other countries. Very few service providers ask about transit events, ask about recent trauma, even at borders throughout our world. And we've heard today in graphic detail the many barriers to disclosing, let alone our systematic approach of not feeling that's important. And some of that is built into our law. So as the nexus arguments for asylum and for migration legal arguments, our international and national legal systems prioritize those events that happen to people while they're in their home countries. So this issue becomes really complicated when the journey is not just a couple days and not just through an airplane to Houston, Texas, but it's months or longer when people cross 4 or 5 country borders. The challenges, as you heard today, are greatly magnified, including the diffusion of responsibility for the acts that occur in any single country. But the psychological consequences of the sexual violence and other forms of violence that were part of these people's lives in their home countries is augmented by everything they face en route to safety. And many of our clients, as I said, admit not only to sexual violence, but death threats all the way through. Sextortion, as was described, and other forms of extortion are extremely common. They go along with the sexual violence. They accompany them. So we should count on hearing threats, especially death threats or family death threats, as well as that sexual violence. The lady we talked about last night who impacted me so much said, and I'll quote one line, as she was standing on the shores of the Rio Grande, she said, I asked what she felt. She said, I didn't want to get caught. I didn't want to get killed, and I didn't want to be raped. So I was terrified. So then they passed through the US-Mexican border and now they're in a new country. They need to rapidly find a place to live, to learn English, to get a job, to find a bank, to get their children enrolled in schools, while their resilience is limited under the best circumstances. And those are things we expect without any processing or even accounting for that trauma. So when we don't collect transit or deportation trauma, we completely miss the opportunity to understand the cumulative trauma that destabilizes day-to-day life and can occur for decades. Sexual violence and threats of death are an unspoken normative part of transit, not just through Central America, but through all of Africa and coming up through South America to New York City, for example. The only rational response you can have to that as a migrant is that I'm just going to reach my goal and I'm going to deny and avoid discussions of what happened about it. We know that the experience of extraordinary violence can make us, all of us, unable or unwilling to recall what we think are small or less significant events than we've had. And I hear it all the time, the denial of this wasn't an important event of sexual violence. I'm just going to tell you about it, Dr. K, but it pales in comparison to the other 20 years of this behavior. But we have the opportunity to even briefly emphasize with every survivor that we are ready to hear whatever they want and need to say. And I will close with my experience in Syria, which is in the news everywhere in the world right now. And that is the cumulative effect of sexual violence. In this case, it was men. We did a study that was in the Lancet journals of males with sexual violence in detention in Syria. Could have been just forced nudity, or could have been witnessing of sexual violence in that setting that was incredibly against their religion and their culture. We followed them for 10 years after detention release. And what we found was interpersonal violence in their families, rage, isolation, and long-term depression and PTSD symptoms in these survivors 10 years after this violation. This deficit that we have in the data results in a huge gap in national policy and international practice. It's impossible to create a great training program and support expectations of service providers when we don't know the type, the prevalence, or the impact of sexual violence during transit or deportation. We need to teach doctors how to promote and elicit disclosure using the best international protocols, such as the Murad Code for history taking and safe disclosure. We need to make consistent referrals for needed services and brief interventions that can help make a difference on the next part of the journey. And we need to recognize the additive effects of human rights violations during transit on family resilience and recovery. I recommend required data fields for transit trauma and impact and research on the barriers to disclosure and best practices for acute trauma and client-centered interventions in the field. I love the statement that happened at the beginning from Olivia, and that is that this work can reduce the impact by assuring that we are truthful, focus on justice and on healing. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Colleen.
Thank you,
Nuevamente,
Colleen.
tu
Once again,
exposición es reflejo de cuán
your
complejo
intervention
es
reflects
abordar
how
este
complex it
tema,
is to address
principalmente
this
con
topic,
traumas acumulados,
mainly
que como bien
with
señalas,
cumulative trauma,
desestabilizan el día a día de
because
las
as you very well
personas,
pointed out,
que así nos lo
these
nombran.
traumas
Y también hay
destabilize the
muchos
day-to-day
principios
life of people.
respecto de
And
lo
there
que
are many
nos has
principles
compartido
about what you
que
shared
están
with us
contemplados en el Código
that are
Murad,
enshrined in the
pero más
Murad
allá de esos
Code.
principios, me gustaría
But going beyond those
presentarlos
principles, I'd
generales
like to
y
highlight
solamente de uno.
the
No puedo
complexities
enfocar
of
en
only
uno,
one, and I'm
que
going
es
to
el
focus
tema
on
de
one. That is to understand survivors as people, as individuals, as human beings. And that is the beginning. And it would be a good beginning for any intervention if we are dealing with victims and survivors, particularly in 1.5, which is identifying augmented risk. It sounds like a simple thing, but if we take a look at it from the perspective of human mobility, we're talking about many situations that when people reach their destination, they are simply there. And sometimes, or many times, they cannot express what happened. We came to the end of these participations, but there is a comment in the questions and answers, and it says that in Guatemala there is impunity regarding sexual violence, and the public ministry usually does not provide the desired results. And I would like to open up these minutes that we have for one or two questions, if you would like to share them with us and with our panelists, so that we can perhaps try to provide a response in the remaining answers. I don't know if there are any other questions or any comments that you would like to make.
I can see that Sophia Cardona has her hand up, so we can give the floor to you, Sophia.
Hi, I hope you can hear me. Excellent. Thank you so much for this dialogue. It has been astounding and it has been fascinating, and it also, I think, is a testament to how flexible the Murad Code is, not just for research, but for a series of interventions with GVV survivors, where the principles recap, so to speak, the GVV guiding principles and a whole series of instruments that we have in a way that is survivor-centered and survivor-led. I guess I one of the things that I wanted to ask you, I think one of the things in Mexico that we're seeing, and this really brings me to every single time that we're speaking to survivors in this region, they're telling us, yeah, this was bad, but this is worse. It's like an increasing horror. I just hearing like the Darien was terrible. Guatemala was worse than the Darien. In Mexico, we're hearing Mexico is worse than Guatemala and the Darien. And then by the time that they get to the United States, of course, they've crossed the entire breadth of the country and experienced really terrible things. I was wondering if you have any comment or suggestion in how sometimes in receiving disclosures, particularly when there's involvement of organized crime or extortion by officials, survivors, but also caseworkers may feel at risk because you know this, because you know information that now maybe also puts the caseworker at risk. We've had some concerns now from workers working in the south of the border, but also in the northern border, about the fact that they happen to know too much about how organized crime operates, about what damage they're doing to people. And so now we also have caseworkers to be concerned about, and not just the GVV survivors that they're helping. This, of course, I think is also an experience in countries in Latin America, such as Colombia, where we had the conflict and everything. But I think organized crime represents a really complex challenge in this situation, a security challenge specifically. So I wondered if any of the participants, of the panelists, could maybe say something about that.
Bueno, quizá yo me atrevo, Verónica.
Perhaps I
Creo
would
que
like to
el
answer.
tema de las
Veronica?
redes de tráfico de personas sí son,
People
bueno,
trafficking
redes
networks
internacionales,
are
¿verdad?
international
Y
networks, of
efectivamente
course,
requeriría un esfuerzo.
and
La verdad que no tengo
they
información si
demand
esto se está haciendo, si
an
hay,
effort.
digamos,
I don't know if there
coordinaciones
is
entre los distintos
coordination
países para el
within
combate
the different
de estas
countries
redes que son muy poderosas. No es solo el tráfico
to
y trata de
combat
personas, sino que muchas
these
veces
very,
está
very
vinculado al
important
narcotráfico.
networks. This is
Ahí
also
hay
related not only
vinculaciones,
to
¿verdad?
people
Y al
trafficking, but
tráfico de
also
armas.
drug trafficking and
Yo
sometimes
creo que
weapon
sí,
trafficking.
efectivamente es un reto enorme y que
So I
no
think this is
puede
a
un
very
solo país,
significant
digamos,
challenge,
como hacer
and a
frente a este
single country
fenómeno, ¿verdad?
alone
Además, son
cannot face
millones de
this
dólares lo que se
phenomenon.
mueve ahí, ¿verdad? El
Millions of
pago de cada
dollars
persona que
are involved
migra.
in the in
Entonces,
payment,
a mí sí
right,
me,
for
sí,
each
siempre
person that
piensa
migrates.
que
And
el
so
tema es
I've always
algo
thought
que debe ser coordinado,
that this is something that
sea internacional, que pueda
it has to
cumplir.
be a coordinated
Aquí se ha
effort,
tratado
internationally
de
coordinated.
combatir las redes de
We
coyotaje, pero
tried
eso es muy
to
limitado
combat the
porque son
coyote
las redes
networks
como
here,
locales, ¿verdad? Eso
but these are
no es
local networks,
suficiente.
so the efforts are limited, and so they're not enough.
Eso me
They're not
parece bien.
sufficient. So this is what I think about
Muchas
this.
gracias, Judith. Adelante, Carolina.
Thank you, Judith.
Gracias.
Carolina,
Sí,
go
en el
ahead.
tema del crimen organizado tenemos
Yes, well,
desafíos
we have
muy
significant
importantes
challenges in
porque
organized
lo que
crime
hemos observado
because what we have
últimamente,
observed
sobre todo
lately,
respecto de
particularly
las organizaciones criminales dedicadas a la trata de
criminal
personas,
organizations
es la
devoted
utilización de una
to
excesiva
people's trafficking
violencia
is the
respecto de
use of
las víctimas.
excessive
O sea,
violence
las víctimas
towards the
son
victims.
trasladadas,
Victims are
sufren violencia
transferred,
sexual,
they suffer from sexual
puede
violence,
ser, por ejemplo, para
perhaps
ingresar, porque
in order
ingresan
to
obviamente ilegalmente a los países de la ruta hasta
go
que llegan al
in
país de destino.
the
A
different
las
countries
organizaciones
illegally,
criminales
right?
eso no le
The criminal
importa, y si
organization
llega a
doesn't
ocurrir
care about
tampoco
the fact
es
that
una situación
the
que
victims
les
are
genere
being
alguna complicación.
are going into the
Sin
different
embargo,
countries
las
illegally,
víctimas son
and
sometidas no
the victims
solamente a
are
explotación sexual,
subjected not only
no
to sexual
solamente a
exploitation,
amenazas
not
verbales,
only
sino
to verbal threats,
directamente
but also
sufren lesiones físicas e
they
incluso
suffer
tortura,
uh,
que es
torture
un fenómeno
many
que ya por lo
times.
menos
And this
en la
is
región
something
estamos
that
observando
in
hace
the region
algunos
we
años
are
atrás
observing. We
y
have been
se
observing this
suma
for a
a
few years now.
otro tipo de
And this is
incluso violencia
compounded
que se
with
relaciona,
the
por
fact that
ejemplo,
there is
cuando las
other
víctimas
violence. For
tratan
example,
de escapar
when
de la
victims try
organización
to
criminal
escape from the criminal
y
organization
no han pagado la multa, por
and they
ejemplo,
haven't paid for
se
their
denomina en algunos
fine,
casos, comillas, patero,
this is
que
um,
consiste en disparar a
a
las
sit-
víctimas
there is a
en la
situation
zona de
where
la rodilla
victims
hasta el
are
pie
shot
para
between the
que,
knee and
como
the
última
foot,
amenaza, para que
and this is the last
efectivamente
threat, so
sean
that
explotadas sexualmente y
they can be
efectivamente
sexually
entreguen el dinero
exploited
de esa explotación a la
and they can
organización criminal.
and they actually
El tema
provide
de las
the
torturas de las
money coming
víctimas
from that
va
sexual exploitation
vinculado
to
a aquellas víctimas
their
que se
bosses, let's
prestan de
say.
alguna manera
And so torture
a la
is
explotación sexual
applied
cuando han
to
sido
victims
inicialmente
that do not
engañadas,
want to be
¿verdad?
sexually
Respecto a sus
exploited, and
condiciones
particularly when
van a
they were
estar en el país
deceived
destino
about the
o cuando
conditions
precisamente
of
las han
their country of
engañado
destination, or
indicándoles
whether
que
when they were
iban
deceived
a realizar, por ejemplo, un
because they
trabajo
told them
cuidando
that they were going to be
a algún
taking
niño o niña
care
y
of
al
children,
final les dicen
perhaps
no,
they're
en
going to
realidad
be they were going to
tú
be working,
tienes que
but then when they
prestar
get
servicios
here,
sexuales
they
a tus
say,
hijos.
no, you have to provide
Entonces,
sexual
o sea,
services.
ese fenómeno de la
So
delincuencia
the
organizada transnacional
transnational
se ha
organized
vinculado
crime
últimamente con situaciones
is
de extrema violencia
connected with
hacia las
the
víctimas
situations that
propiamente tal.
involve extreme
Coordinaciones
violence towards
internacionales
the
respecto a esa
victims.
parte de la pregunta,
And
sí hay
regarding
esfuerzos
international
para
coordination, of course,
realizar
we have
coordinaciones
efforts to have
internacionales de
international
forma oportuna y
coordination
eficaz,
in a timely
especialmente
and
yo
effective
diría hoy
way.
día,
Particularly, I
la
would say
conformación de equipos conjuntos de
there are
investigación ha
joint
sido una experiencia muy
investigation
positiva. De
teams, and this
hecho,
was a very
a nivel
positive
regional, a nivel
experience.
de
In
Latinoamérica,
fact, at the
contamos con
Latin
el primer
American
equipo
level, we
conjunto
have the
de
first
investigación
joint
conformado en
team
materia de tráfico
for
ilícito de
investigation,
migrantes
both
entre
for
Perú
illegal
y Chile,
um,
que terminó con
migrant
un resultado
smuggling
exitoso.
between Peru and Chile that
Y
was
por último,
very
respecto a la
successful.
pregunta, creo
And
que es
last,
muy
regarding the
importante
question, I
considerar
think it's very
que
important to
dentro
consider
de
that
las organizaciones criminales dedicadas a la trata de personas,
criminal
estamos hablando, ya
organizations
lo
for
señalaba Judith,
devoted
vinculado al
to human
tráfico de
trafficking
droga, estamos hablando de
is, well,
organizaciones
and this is also related
criminales
with drug trafficking.
multipropósito o
This is a
multigiro
these are
que se
multi-purpose
dedican
criminal
al tráfico de
organizations, and
drogas, se
so
dedican a
they
la
are
trata de
engaged
personas,
in
se dedican al tráfico ilícito
drug
de
trafficking,
migrantes, al
migrant
tráfico de armas y a
smuggling,
veces mezclan,
human
¿cierto?
trafficking,
Y a la
weapon
víctima le conviene en proceso
smuggling, and
más,
sometimes
por
they
ejemplo, la
mix. So
obligan a
a
portar
victim
droga o
who is
aportar armas
uh,
para que ingresen ilegalmente a un
traveling
país
is
determinado.
obliged to perhaps carry drugs. And so, but regarding human trafficking, there is a very significant impact of the fact that the investment, quote unquote, in this business is very low and the profits are very high because the victims, the people go beyond drugs. And therefore, it's very important to make this phenomenon of human trafficking visible, and particularly sexual abuse that is related to these two crimes, human trafficking and migrant smuggling.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Colleen has also answered Sophia's question, saying that the security of interviewers is essential. Thanks for this question. In her experience, well, we have very specific safeguards in place regarding the interviews, and this should be done everywhere, particularly in settings in which interviewers feel at risk. We are getting to the end. I want to thank you all very much for participating. I'd also like to thank the interpreters for all their work. Thank you so much. My colleague will post on the Murad Code project site, or better say, she'll include the website of the Murad Code in case you want to download the code. And this conversation we've held will be posted on the Murad Code site. For me, it's been a great pleasure and a challenge to be a host here today. And I wish you all a very good day. I wish to thank the panelists for their patience and for having shared their incredible experiences. And also thank you for your generosity and for your time. Thank you very much.